Welcome to JCT TV. This is Bible study for the 21st century. Well, friends, it's a new year, and I have got a great guest at the beginning of this new year. Corie Hembree is with me. She's been on the program before. A lot of you who watch Bible Discovery TV know her very well informed, very enthusiastic, interesting guest, talking about the Bible. We're going to talk about the Bible all month as a kind of a kickoff to the new year. And as you follow along with Corie, I think you're going to be really, really stimulated to get on reading. I'll be back right after this.
JCT TV is the official voice of WOW, working for orphans and widows. Jim Cantelon is the founder of WOW and has been ministering to orphans and widows in distress for 18 years. WOW's focus is home-based care for the dying. The horizon is vast, with thousands of the least of these in Africa and India. WOW depends on your generous support. To do so, simply contact us by phone, mail, or online.
As I mentioned off the top, I'm really very, very pleased that Corie Hembree is with me. She's been on the program before, and a lot of you wanted her back, so now she's back. You've got what you wanted, and it is the new year, Corie.
It is.
Resolution time. Are you making any resolutions?
Well, every year, because I work with Bible Discovery, every year I go through the Bible. Yeah. But this year specifically, I wanted to write down notes on every chapter as I'm going through. So that's been my resolution this year. Yeah.
So one day we'll be reading not Matthew Henry's commentary on the Bible, but Corie Hembree's commentary on the Bible.
I don't know. We'll see about that. But
I know what that's like because, researching and writing my Cantelon's Casual Commentary. I mean, I've been in the ministry for 50 years, but this is the most demanding, I think, process I've ever been through. I mean, you do research for sermons.
Yes.
But when you're doing research for writing and you're having to not necessarily make all the reference points, but you're having to make sure you know what you're talking about.
Yes.
That's a real discipline.
Yes.
Now, speaking of which, it is the new year, and a lot of people, and I know this is true, are making resolutions. And many believers, many followers of Jesus are making the commitment to reading their Bibles. Sometimes we fall a little short on that, but nevertheless, this is a new year, and they're going to do it. You have been studying the Bible intensely for many years for Bible Discovery. We could go anywhere right now with this interview, but let me start with this.
Sure.
Do you have a favorite book in the Bible?
To be honest, it changes. I think it changes with me as I grow and age and get into different situations in my life. But I do have some soft spots, and I think one of them definitely is Kings and Chronicles, First and Second Kings.
Really?
Yes, because I love history, and I find the account of personal lives and some of the political situations going on so interesting, and how God spoke through those circumstances to people and how he still is speaking to us through those circumstances. I find the whole thing really interesting.
Now, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles is pretty raw reading.
It is, yeah.
I mean, there's thousands, tens of thousands of people being killed in battles. There's palace intrigues. There's all kinds of difficult things that King David is facing, that other kings are facing. Sometimes you read some of what's going on there and you say, whoa, I'm not sure I want to read this.
Yeah, it can be very abrasive because the time period is much different from our own. It's life and death. There's war. It's not pretty. But I find there's a couple things about it that I love, is that God still shows who he is through that. And you get to see the results of kings and queens and people who either decide to try to follow God in their context or not. And you get to see the narrative that weaves through the whole history of Israel and Judah. And I think the other thing that's really amazing is that at this point in history, in the Kings and Chronicles, you can also get histories from, for example, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, and you can get a more holistic view of what exactly was going on that would have been understood by those people, and they would have understood, why kings are making these decisions for God or not for God. I think of Hezekiah's father, Ahaz, who he famously turns the kingdom back towards idolatry. And he actually goes in league with the Assyrian king. And when you look at that situation, he's desperate. He's desperate to try to find a way to save his kingdom. And so he chooses to follow the war gods of the Syrians as opposed to Yahweh of the Israelites. And so when you understand the context there, you realize that he was in a really tough spot and he made a decision, albeit the wrong one, and then you get to see how that plays out. So I really like the bird's eye view that we can get now looking back at that history.
Now, those very scriptures speak of Hezekiah in the most glowing terms.
Yes.
In fact, as I recall, there is an observation made that he may have been the finest, the most righteous of all the kings. And I'm thinking, well, more righteous than David?
I know, right?
And I mean, but he was an outstanding guy. And again, you see this with the kings. You get this guy and usually this is the theme, who did evil in the sight of the Lord, but once in a while, these evil guys have these very righteous sons. And conversely, sometimes righteous kings have very unrighteous sons.
Yes, that is a theme even going back into the time period of the judges. You see even Samuel's sons, right? Not just completely going against the character of their father, which is really interesting as well.
I think sometimes for people who are reading this and who have real difficult challenges with their own children's lack of faith, that it might be instructive for them to understand what we all know is true, and that is every child born is his own free moral agent.
Yes.
And they can have godliness modeled for them, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to follow in their parents' footsteps.
Yeah, everyone has their own life to live and their own decisions to make, and it is what it is at some point.
Something that maybe the average reader doesn't fully appreciate is that during that period of the kings, and even previous to that, of course, the worldview was much different than now. They had a kind of a pantheon of local deities, and Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for many was seen as Israel and Judah's local deity.
Yes.
You remember the story of Naaman the Syrian? He comes to Elisha with leprosy, doesn't like what Elisha tells him to do. Is going to go off in a fit of pique, but his servant says, look, if he asked you to do this or do that, you would have done it. So if he tells you to go in the Jordan and dip yourself 7 times, do it for pity's sake. Which he did, and he's healed. Yeah. So on the way back to Syria, he's saying, can I take a little dirt with me, please? And he puts a load of dirt on a donkey's back. Why? Because he wants to create a shrine in Syria, because the God who's healed him is the God of that dirt. Yeah. Now, the average reader who's not had any kind of background reading or understanding of this would say, what? What's going on there? But it's interesting how the view of God, and the Lord allowed this to happen, developed incrementally instead of all of a sudden.
Yes. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about the character of God, is that he plays a long game. I think even of my own personality, when I'm faced with, when I'm talking to one of my friends and they say something and the theology is a little bit off and it doesn't go with, I want to jump in and correct it. I want to go, okay, but wait, I know we're talking about something else, but let's stop and let's fix that so that you can have an accurate understanding. And I want that for myself as well. But it is a very curious aspect of the nature of God that he plays a longer game than we do. And he is okay with us having a little bit of misunderstanding and misconception about him because it's going to grow and it's going to change.
Yeah, I mean, as the Apostle Paul said in 1 Corinthians 13, now we see through a glass darkly.
Yes.
We all have spiritual astigmatisms.
It's very true.
None of us is seeing things spiritual with a clear lens. So we're all basically learning. How long have you been working with Bible Discovery Television?
I've been working on television for about 15 years. The first 5 of those, I was on maybe once or twice a week and doing different things, sometimes bringing historical and archaeological, cultural backdrops for the scripture, but also doing journalistic reports on the persecuted church and things of that nature. But for the last 10 years, I've been every day on the program. So that's 6 days a week. So that's 10 years that I've been doing that part.
That's a lot of television and a lot of study. You obviously like it.
I love it. I love it.
I can
love
tell.
It.
Getting back to First, Second Kings, First, Second Chronicles. I asked you about favorite book, and you said you have a tendency in that direction. What about a favorite king or two? Who are some of the kings that really stand out in your mind?
I think Uzziah is a very interesting king called Uzziah in Chronicles because he exists in this very strange time period of peace where the enemy focus, which is Assyria at that point, is more north. It hasn't really quite come south to Judah yet, but everyone knows that it's going to. And so the Bible has some really interesting things to say about what he did. He experimented with some technology, warfare technology, and things of that nature. So I think he's a really interesting guy just because he's different and he's unique.
Before you move on from him, I think he reigned about 50 years, did he not?
Yeah, long time.
Yeah, and he died ultimately of leprosy.
Yes, he did.
Much loved. Isaiah, in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. That's Isaiah 6, I think it is. But you're right, he was one outstanding guy. Started reigning, as many kings did, at a very young age.
Very young age. And there is a potential tombstone for him as well in secondary use.
There is?
Yeah, there is.
No,
there is.
That's news to me.
There's
where?
Off the top of my head, I can't remember where it is right now. But if you look it up, there is a gravestone that it has incised on it the name of King Uzziah.
Really?
So it is probably marking a secondary, coming in and remarking, but yeah, it exists, and it talks about his leprosy.
Now we got about a minute and a half. Another king you're going to mention.
I love Hezekiah. Hezekiah, that from that time period, I think he's so interesting, to be so gloriously spoken of, and yet for Jerusalem and Judah to have just survived. It's spoken of as a great victory, and spiritually it was a great victory, but physically it wasn't. So I really like that. I really like that balance where life isn't just determined by what we see physically. It's not just about those things. So if the world looks at you and goes, well, it's just you, you've lost everything else. But spiritually, there can be a great victory there. And that was Hezekiah.
Yeah, and the Lord gave him an extra 15 years too.
He did.
He was sick and dying, and he whined a bit.
He did. He definitely did.
And the Lord graciously gave him another 15 years. I was a little astonished when I read the first time, and every time I read it again, as things were going off the rails that last 15 years. He said, well, I don't care. I'm not going to be around. I'm not going to be around, let my sons deal with that. And I thought, well, come on, Hezekiah. But,
I know, buck up. And then it didn't go very well, did it, after that? He kind of gave up, and his kids kind of gave up too.
But again, that human element is there. And I certainly concur with your appreciation for the Bible's openness dealing with warts and all in these guys. Well, Corie, we're going to continue this next program. And if you are beginning to find the Bible fascinating, stay on that track, because it really is the best book, the bestseller of all time. And Corie Hembree will be back with me again next show.
Jim Cantelon Today is a program dedicated to the teaching of the good news of Jesus Christ. This all through the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. JCT also brings to you encouraging testimonies and stories from Christian leaders all over the globe. If this program has added value to your life, would you please consider becoming a partner? To do so, simply contact us by phone, mail, or online.
So we're picking up our study now in Mark chapter 2, verse 23, and this is the first of several what are called Sabbath controversies. Now, I think most of you understand the concept of Sabbath. You know, in the Christian world, Sabbath is seen as Sunday, the Lord's Day, but in the Jewish context, of which Jesus was a part, of course, being a Jew himself, Sabbath, or Shabbat, as we say even to this day in Israel, started at sundown on Friday and finished at sundown on Saturday. And so essentially the night of Friday and the all day until sunset on Saturday was Shabbat. Queen Sabbath, as she was called, still highly regarded, especially by Orthodox Jews in Jerusalem to this day, and around the world, I might say, by the Orthodox Jewish communities. You're aware of the fact that for 7 years, my wife and I lived in Jerusalem, Israel. We were invited by the government to plant a church there. You can Google King of Kings Jerusalem and see how it's doing. It's been a long, long time, since 1983 when we founded it. But what a great story it is. However, having said that, Sabbath is the same now as it was when we first moved to Jerusalem in 1981. It is a very special day. One thing we had to get used to when we moved to Jerusalem was the fact that shops and most restaurants close just around 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon, and by 5 o'clock, 5:30, there's a horn that sounds over the whole city. It sounds like an air raid horn, and that marks the beginning of Shabbat. And if you are an observant Jew, you do not turn your lights on, you do not drive your car, you do not turn on your stove. Anything that approximates lighting a fire is forbidden for that 24-hour period. So how do the Orthodox families get around that? Well, they all have what's called automatic lighting systems, which basically turn the lights on automatically, so no one is required to light a fire by turning on a switch. And the food for the Shabbat meal, Kabbalat Shabbat meal, welcoming the Sabbath meal, on Friday night, is pre-cooked and preheated, and they have containers that keep the food hot. And it's a very special time. One thing you know is that every Israeli family that can is together. It's, you know, we celebrate Christmas, for instance, in the Christian world, and a big part of it, if not the major part of it, is family together. Well, in the Jewish families, it's family together every Friday night. So Sabbath is really, really a very, very special time. If you're going to go anywhere in Jerusalem on Shabbat, there's no buses. Very few cars are running. And so you walk. And you'll see people out walking, sometimes carrying challah bread, as it's called, bottles of wine, flowers to their parents' home. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful time. I used to walk from our place up to Mount Zion, and I used to attend 2 or 3 synagogues. I would just go kind of randomly and share in the services, and I absolutely loved it. But no work on Sabbath. And here, this was the issue. Let's take a look at the scripture here, beginning with verse 23. It happened that he went through the grain fields, referring to Jesus, on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. And the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" But he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry? He and those with him, how he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath." Okay, here's what's going on here. Jesus is walking through some grain fields with his disciples, and they're doing what I used to do when I was a preacher's kid growing up in Saskatchewan. Walking through a grain field, you just put your hand around some of the heads of the wheat and you pull it up, and all these kernels come into your hand, and it takes a little doing to get rid of the husks. And then once you've done that, you pop them in your mouth and break your teeth. It's like trying to chew on pebbles. But if you're faithful and kind of just work at it gradually, eventually they break down a bit and you get this lovely taste and aroma of fresh grain. Beautiful. This is what the disciples were doing. And the Pharisees, they were the conservative religious grouping in Israel at the time, who were always having trouble with Jesus, were shocked by this and came to Jesus and finding fault with him by extension and his disciples specifically, because they were harvesting on Shabbat. Not allowed, verboten, must not do it. So this was a controversy. And Jesus responds in a remarkable way. Let me just kind of go through this. Essentially, what is at issue here is what is sacred. And I think what we can learn from this passage I've just read is that no institution is sacred in itself. People are sacred. Sabbath is a study in itself, and it's worth studying. There were Sabbath laws, many of them. It was called a Talmud. It was really quite a system telling you what you could and couldn't do, what was and wasn't legal to do on Shabbat, because Shabbat technically means cessation, means desistance. It means that all physical labor was taboo. As the tradition taught, Shabbat was a day of quieting the heart. We don't know, because Mark doesn't tell us here, but it's quite likely that the disciples were not only transgressing the law of harvesting on Shabbat, but they were probably transgressing the law on what's called the Sabbath day's journey. They were walking much, much farther than a Sabbath day's journey, according to the Talmud, allowed. What was a Sabbath day's journey? Well, you may recall, if you are biblically apprised, in Acts chapter 1, verse 12, the Mount of Olives is described as a Sabbath day's journey from Jerusalem. Now, I've walked that many times. Jerusalem is up on Mount Zion. You go down into the Kidron Valley and then back up on the Mount of Olives to the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's about, 2,500 to 3,000 steps. And a Sabbath day's journey was defined by the rabbis as 3,637 feet. Now, how did they come up with that? Well, in Joshua chapter 3, when Joshua and the children of Israel are carrying the ark, the Ark of the Covenant that had the Ten Commandments in it, and Aaron's rod that budded, and it was a very special kind of container that represented the presence of God with the people of Israel. They walked 2,000 cubits ahead of the people. Now, 2,000 cubits is this length from here, your elbow, to the tip of your middle finger, okay? That's a cubit. And, for most of us, that's about 1.5 feet, right? So 2,000 cubits essentially translates into, you got it, 3,000 feet, or thereabouts. This was a Sabbath day's journey. But there were loopholes that developed, because sometimes when Jewish people wanted to visit their friends, it was more than a Sabbath day's journey away. So here's what they were allowed to do. They could establish a temporary home the day before Shabbat by carrying food for 2 meals to a given spot. It could be a wall, it could be a tree, it could be a cave, whatever. They would carry 2 meals. And when they got to that place, which was a Sabbath day's journey away, 3,000 feet, they would have that first meal there. And by so doing, they were establishing a home. Then the next day, they come back to that home, and with the next meal, strengthening them, they could go another 3,000 feet. You can say, come on, loophole city. Well, yeah, It was a way of getting around this onerous Talmudic law, but that's what they would do. And so they could legally double their walking distance on Shabbat, and no one thought anything of it. Well, this was part of the legalistic culture of the time. And Jesus essentially is springing out of this and saying, look, Sabbath serves us. We don't serve it. Okay? The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Now, that same principle applies to a lot of the legalistic rules and regulations that have been passed down throughout the centuries, not just by Jews, but by Orthodox Christians as well.
The Bible tells us that true religion is visiting orphans and widows in their distress. The Bible also says that God is a father to the fatherless and a defender of widows. Heaven's core values for mankind begin with God's heart for the least of these. When you support WOW, you're in the sweet spot of God's heart for the poor. Yes, we're only a small player in this great drama, but at least we're on the field. Please give generously.
Friends, we're getting a lot of interest in Cantelon's casual commentary. We've got Matthew here. I do it in tranches so they can fit into an envelope. Makes it cheap to mail it out to you because we're very concerned that we get the best value for, our donated dollar. But also can fit in a pocket or, in your purse or whatever. But that's Matthew. This is the first volume of Mark. Second volume of Mark is coming out real soon. But here's the thing. When you send in support for JCT and WOW, Working for Orphans and Widows, you need to ask for this, okay? You mustn't assume that we're going to send it out to you unless you ask for it. The reason for that is a lot of you have it, and if we just send it out automatically every time, you'd have far more commentaries than you want. But just remember to ask for it, and then our staff will make sure that it's sent out to you ASAP, and you can enjoy it as I fill in the blanks in writing what I can't do on television. See you next time.